Now, generally, people think that evil and goodness are perhaps subjective. Um, but even if they are, let's say, they would only be subjective to the degree that we have disagreements about the values that constitute as good or the values that constitute as bad. Um, but I do think there are features of goodness, regardless of our disagreements about certain values, and evil per se, that have some interesting features that we could see, um, that are, I would say, pretty objective. So, for example, evil has a tendency that it has the feature of it cannot be transparent. It cannot be transparent to others, right? So if you were to steal a bank and were to announce that you were going to steal a bank and everybody knew that you were going to steal a bank, it would go against your own self interest to achieve that goal. So evil has to have a kind of discrepancy or appearance of the good, right? Nobody should know that you're trying to steal a bank. Um, and the same thing with lying. Lying, people can't know that you're lying. Um, it has to present itself as a kind of truth. And then if they know that you're lying, the value of a lie then loses itself. It only has its value in the privation as the presentation of a truth. Um, so it seems that evil, whatever it is, right, or goodness, whatever it is, um, they have certain features. For example, goodness has the luxury of being transparent. It doesn't actually work against its own benefit to be transparent. Um, Whereas, again, like I said, evil does. Um, and then also, something interesting about evil is that evil, because it has to present itself in a way that is not transparent, it seems to have more constraints than goodness does. And it also seems to have a suffocating feature to it. So, for example, if you are a pervasive liar, you would have to keep track of all your lies and remember all your lies, and then you would eventually have to ask yourself, am I living a life that I wanted, or am I even living a pleasurable life anymore, because I have to live in such a way that I have to keep up with all my lies. And it's work to keep up with all my lies and remember all my lies. And at this point, I'm just making a life that isn't actually mine anymore, right? Because they're lies. Um, so it's interesting that evil has this feature of a quantitative increase in constraints. Um, and it seems that in order for evil to maintain itself, it has to keep increasing the number of constraints to the point that it would perhaps be unmanageable or confining to live. Just imagine, a man being hunted down for murder. Um, he has no choice now but to live in another country or something, right? If he can make it across the border, um, right? Or if he's being hunted across internationally, right? He would only have whoever would give them a place to stay, right? Um, so it would seem that evil, no matter what it does, has a tendency to increase its constraints, and this quantitative increasing of constraints then leads to a kind of qualitative, I would say, diminishment of life. Ironically, um, we can also just look at it in a sort of general law perspective, right? of you reach to confinement. Um, Although we use jails, and the justice system has its own kind of sense of that, but for the most part, evil would be kind of inherently confining, precisely because if you persisted in it, you would only further increase your constraints and suffocate the life that you would like to live. Ironically, you would not be able to have the life you could live, because it seems to be a feature of evil that it constantly increases its constraints. Whereas goodness seems to be in such a way that, and perhaps I'm wrong, seems to be in such a way that goodness can thrives better if it can minimize its constraints. If it can minimize its constraints to the sort of bare essentials. Um, and in that sense, there's more freedom in goodness, or the good, if one can is able to determine that without being deceived. There's more freedom in the good, precisely because there is less constraints. And to achieve a higher form of goodness, um, would be to actually start taking away certain forms of constraints by paradoxically adding some constraints. um, so, yeah, I haven't really thought too far on that. But yeah, I would say, I think, just for the bare essentials, though, goodness generally aims at minimizing the amount of constraints for freedom and a life that is worth living. But yeah, anyways, that's it.